All right, we will get started now. Welcome, everybody. I'm really glad you're here with us today. You are at the Economic Development Collaborative webinar about Cal OSHA. My name is Emily Barony. I run a company called Visionality, and we are very proud EDC clients. I'm here as your co-host, and we also have a crack team on the back end running the Zoom for you today. The Economic Development Collaborative is a private nonprofit that is dedicated to maintaining the county's economic health and vitality. Since 1996, they have been delivering programs that support business retention and growth, attraction, and entrepreneurship. As a community lender, the EDC has funded $20 million in requests, created 1,200 new local jobs, and within their commitment to reaching underserved communities, 67% of EDC loans have been awarded to minority and woman-owned businesses. And I am very proud to say I am one of those recipients. Thank you, EDC. The EDC hosts the region's Small Business Development Center that provides no-cost professional consulting to small business owners in Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Los Angeles counties. And with a team of over 40 advisors in 2020, the EDC engaged with over 19,000 businesses across the counties and provided more than 11,000 hours of free direct business consulting and access to capital. Again, I'm one of the proud recipients of those consulting hours, and it really helped us get through the pandemic. So just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, this is set up as a webinar, so everyone is muted and your cameras are off. This is being recorded, and you will get an email in the next few days with a link to the recording and any resources that we might mention. And you will also, in that same email, get a copy of the PowerPoint. Please submit any questions using the Q&A feature. It's at the bottom of your screen. If you do accidentally put those in the chat, we'll just remind you to put them back in the Q&A so that they don't get missed on accident. And if you are calling in today by phone, you can submit questions by email. So get a pen ready. You can email your questions to webinar@edcollaborative.com. So again, if you're calling in by phone and have questions, you can email them to webinar@edcollaborative.com. If you have any tech issues, please put them in the chat. We've got the amazing Brianne standing by to help. And at the end of the webinar, we will share our phone number for the business assistance line. And I know our friends at Fisher Phillips will also share their contact information. And with that, I think we're ready to rock and roll. I'm very excited to introduce Hannah and Imara with Fisher Phillips. Take it away, ladies.
All right. Well, thank you, Emily. We're really happy to be back here with you. And, you know, since the last time we spoke, there have been some updates that we're going to share with you today. So as Emily mentioned, my name's Hannah Swice, and I'm here with my colleague, Imara Ledesma. We're with the law firm Fisher Phillips, focusing on labor and employment for businesses. And we're both out of the LA office, and I'm also out of our Woodland Hills office. So we're going to, today in our presentation cover what the revised emergency temporary standard has in place. And this went into effect as of June 17th of this year. And as many of you know, that kind of was the first revision we've had from the prior ETS. So we'll go through kind of all of what has changed and what you need to know. We're also going to talk through a few of the other changes, on the horizon. But before we delve into the ETS and the changes, we'd like to really kind of take a quick step back and look at where we are and kind of a quick reminder about what we really need to be thinking about in terms of looking at this COVID-19 situation, which keeps changing. Again, hopefully we're moving in the right direction. I know recently we've had, gone backwards a little bit with the situation, but hopefully we can keep moving forward. But what do we need to keep looking at? So we need to look at the federal level. There's the CDC, which has guidance. There's federal OSHA, but because we have a Cal OSHA here, we're really focusing really more on Cal OSHA. But it's important to keep in mind that those are really two of the main kind of federal levels we really need to look at in terms of what guidance comes out, what does federal OSHA say. So just keeping that on your radar. And then at the state level, what we have is we have California's Department of Public Health, which issues guidance. And again, we've seen a lot of alignment now between what Cal OSHA is doing and CDPH. And then we have the state of California, which has put out throughout COVID, has really put out, different sets of guidance. And as we all know, as of June 15th, a lot of those kind of orders and all of that really went away. So we'll really be focusing on Cal OSHA, but again, keeping in mind that these three different levels at the state level can really, have an impact on your business and what are the rules that govern, your particular business. So keeping an eye on those. And then at the local level, what we have is we have the counties and we have the cities. And in all of these levels that we're looking at, federal, state, and local, what is most restrictive is what applies. So that's important to keep in mind, right? Because there is so many different, agencies, government authorities telling us, here's this order, here's this guidance. But what's important to keep in mind is that the most restrictive is what applies. So in thinking about that as we talk today. So as I mentioned, the original ETS went into effect on November 30th, 2020. And what that really did is, as a quick reminder, that's the emergency temporary standards that went into place, implemented by Cal OSHA, essentially telling employers in the workplace setting, if you have employees that report to a work site and are not covered by another standard like healthcare, then you have employees coming to a work site, then you're going to really need to think about, all the rules and regulations that are part of this emergency temporary standard. So we've had that in place since November 30th. And just recently that was revised after there was, a lot of back and forth about, vaccinations, how they have positively impacted the situation and what exemptions should really be implemented in this emergency temporary standards in light of the improved situation given the vaccines. So that was kind of took a while though to get us to June 17th. There was a lot of back and forth. As Aymara knows, she and I are both really on the forefront of these COVID-19 issues at our firm. And she and I have listened in on the Cal OSHA hearings and have really, got to go back and forth on that roller coaster that we went through before they basically issued this revised version. So this revised version went into effect June 17th. It went into effect immediately. And it really was kind of in conjunction with that June 15th date. There was a lot that changed around that time. So there was a lot of pressure to move this forward. And so what we have is we have several areas in the ETS that changed. And so we're really going to focus this discussion on what changed from the past, with an understanding that, if you have some basic underlying questions about the original ETS, we're not necessarily going to cover those, although Aymara is going to talk through what still applies in the original ETS and what things to think about, but we're not going to cover in, detail what exactly were the face covering requirements, what exactly were, all the underlying requirements before and what the changes. We're just going to really focus on the change, okay? So if you have questions about that, given the size of the group and that we should have some time today, we can probably take additional questions at the end. And so please do ask questions and we will address your questions. So the first area, which was a big one, right, and it continues to be a big topic, is the face coverings. And so this is the big change that really was adopted by Cal OSHA. And again, there was a lot of back and forth about what kind of version they would ultimately adopt. And what they ultimately adopt aligns with California's Department of Public Health and the CDC. But as we're going to mention next, this is an area that's in flux. So we'll tell you about the role of face coverings under Cal OSHA and anywhere that does not have a stricter requirement, but we are going to really focus on the fact that there are changes coming in this area. It may not come formally from Cal OSHA, but again, at least at the local levels, we're seeing some changes. So what was the change? Employees now who are fully vaccinated no longer need to wear face coverings. And fully vaccinated, you can't just take an employee's word that they're fully vaccinated. You do have to obtain some sort of documentation from the employee. And Aymar is going to really cover in detail that documentation piece, but important to keep in mind that those employees who are fully vaccinated and provide documentation now no longer need to wear a face covering indoors or in vehicles with others. And so again, this was a lot better alignment with CDPH and CDC that had come out with that guidance. CDC's was in May and CDPH, was shortly thereafter. And what had been in the prior proposal was that everyone in a room is fully vaccinated. And so again, that is not the version that was adopted. The version that's adopted is really the one we know, which is if you're fully vaccinated, you can go ahead and remove masks or face covering. So the one thing to note is that this does not apply in all settings. So for public transit settings, K through 12, and healthcare, long-term care settings, correctional detention facilities, and shelters, there is still this requirement, regardless of vaccination status, that all employees and others need to wear face coverings. What I think important to keep in mind as well is that, again, because there was this prior proposal, I've seen that, with these recent kind of updates with, returning to mask mandates, people are still confused. What if everybody is fully vaccinated? Do we have to still follow this? So again, that just was a prior version. Important to keep in mind that that's not what was ever adopted and it does not apply. So unless there is a more restrictive order in place requiring face coverings regardless of vaccination status, under Cal OSHA, employers must provide face coverings and ensure that they are worn by employees who are not fully vaccinated when indoors or in vehicles with others. So again, it's really important to understand who in your workforce is vaccinated and who is not fully vaccinated so that you can comply with this. And then face coverings are no longer required outdoors, regardless of vaccination status. However, there is language in Cal OSHA's ETS that those employees who are not fully vaccinated and are outdoors and are less than 6 feet from one another, it is recommended that unvaccinated or not fully vaccinated employees outdoors that cannot maintain distance, they are told and encouraged to wear a face covering in those settings. But again, that is not a requirement, that's really a recommendation. And then same limited exemptions apply for those who are not fully vaccinated. Those are the ones that we saw before, which were employees alone in a room or a vehicle while eating or drinking. And then again, if there's specific tasks that can't be performed, there is specific criteria that to follow really in that analysis. And again, there's also exemptions that exist for those who have mental health conditions, medical conditions, and again, engaging the interactive process if those situations come up. And so next I'm going to go into really these local orders that we're seeing, and this is really kind of the recent news. And as many of you have heard, LA County implemented a mask mandate. So we have this Delta variant. We have, a situation where we do still have, quite a large number of the population that has not fully vaccinated. And with that, we're seeing an uptick in cases again. So what some of the counties and cities are doing is they're either implementing a mask mandate or they're implementing a strong, encouragement, a recommendation that everyone wear a mask indoors. And so Ventura County is actually one of those counties who's also issued one of those orders that anybody indoors should wear a mask or a face covering regardless of vaccination status. This is one area that we expect we're going to see some changes probably coming in the next few weeks. And again, one of those levels, if it's at federal, CDC, if it's going to be, you know, state of California goes ahead and issues something saying, you know, here's what is, you know, across the state of California. And then again, local orders are, you know, it's allowable that they issue something more restrictive. So just kind of keeping that one on your radar. Next, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aymara, who's going to talk about documentation and vaccines.
Okay, so I'm sure that this is a very anticipated section. So as Hannah mentioned, if you want to take advantage of some of these exceptions to the ETS, like the face covering requirement, then you have to collect your employees' vaccination status, right? And the revised ETS, just to be clear, it's not a requirement that employers collect their employees' vaccination status, but if you choose not to collect their vaccination status, then you have to treat all of your employees as if they are unvaccinated, which means that you would be operating under much stricter rules than that what are in place. And you would have to, you'd essentially be operating under the old ETS, right? Everyone would have to wear masks at all times. There would be no exceptions when there's an exposure, which we're going to cover later. So you'd have much more strict rules than what is in place. So if you do decide to collect vaccination status, which if you'd like to, you know, really comply with this revised ETS, you essentially have to, even though it's not a requirement. Then the revised ETS says that an employee is considered fully vaccinated, or the employer can consider that their employees are fully vaccinated if they have documented this full vaccination, right? And fully vaccinated means that someone has had either the one shot in a one-dose series vaccine, and it's been at least 14 days since that one shot, or the two shots and the two-dose vaccines like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccinations, and it's been at least 14 days since their second dose. And so you still can't consider them to be fully vaccinated unless you document that that has happened, right? And the big question here when this was being discussed by Cal OSHA was, well, what does that mean, right? Do we have to actually collect everyone's vaccination card, or are there options? Thankfully, Cal OSHA did issue an FAQ telling us what the acceptable options for documenting are. So the first is that the employees provide proof of the vaccination, and the employer maintains a copy. So this would mean that you get a copy of the employee's vaccination card, or a picture of the card, or a note from their doctor saying that they've been fully vaccinated, and then you keep a copy of it. The main issue that comes up with this, and the reason why employers were pretty hesitant about this documentation requirement, is that this is medical information, right? This vaccine card or a doctor's note is medical information. It's confidential, so it has to be kept confidentially, and it can't just be put into an employee's personnel file. We have to keep it in a separate file, so a medical file, where you would keep doctor's notes, things like that. You have to keep separate files for your employees for the vaccine card or the doctor's note. So that's the main issue that comes up with this. Thankfully, there are two other options that I've seen many employers are implementing, either one of these or both of them, and I'll discuss that too. So the second option is that the employee does provide the employer with proof of the vaccination, and then the employer maintains a record of the employees who presented the proof, but they don't actually keep the proof itself, right? So this would mean that someone would be assigned by your company to, look at, check the vaccine card or doctor's note for the employee, and then give it back to the employee, and keep a list or Excel spreadsheet with which employees have shown their proof of vaccination. Obviously that comes with its own challenges, mainly that you have to have someone actually physically checking these things, or receiving emails, and then what do you do with the email that you got? So that raises its own issues of, what do we do with this? How do we implement this, right? A third option, which I think has been the most popular one with a lot of employers, and what we were hoping would be one of the options for businesses, because it's probably the most straightforward way of collecting this information, is to allow employees to self-attest to their vaccination status, and then the employer maintains a record of those self-attestations. So that's pretty straightforward. You would use a self-attestation form. You have employees, go through, check the box saying, I've received one shot, or I've received, I'm fully vaccinated, I've received both, or I'm not vaccinated, or finally, and I'll discuss this a little bit more in detail, but I decline to provide my vaccination status. So that's a straightforward form that you can use. Most employers have chosen this because it avoids the issue of having that vaccine card or doctor's note that you have floating around, and you have to keep it separate and all of that. But one concern I've seen from a lot of employers with this is, what about the employees that aren't going to be truthful with us and they're going to just check whatever box they want? With that, what my suggestion has been to those employers is you can combine these options, right? Nothing says that you only implement one of these. You can implement this self-attestation, and option number 2, check the card, but don't keep a copy of it. And then, keep the record of the self-attestation. That way you've confirmed the vaccine card, but you also have a signed document from your employee saying that they're vaccinated, and you can keep that for your records. So I think you have a lot of options here, but if you are going to be using any of these exceptions for fully vaccinated employees that we're talking about today, you do have to document the vaccine status like this. So there's a couple of questions that come up with, asking for vaccine status from our employees. The first one, first consideration to have in mind is be careful how you ask and what you ask, right? You are asking about medical information here, or medically related, disability related information potentially, right? So if an employee tells you that they're not vaccinated, we don't need to ask further questions such as why, because then we're asking disability related inquiries, right? We might be getting into, the disability or medical condition of an employee that we really don't need to know for these purposes, right? If an employee has need for a reasonable accommodation or something, they should be coming to us with that information separately, hopefully to the correct person. So we don't want, the person that's collecting this information to be the person who's also fielding, gathering accidentally a bunch of disability related or medical information from our employees. So be careful how you ask. So a good way to ask is the self-attestation form, right? Because that's just checking a box, and it doesn't require, obviously employees can ask questions about the form and everything, but it doesn't necessarily require, face-to-face interactions where these employees might be giving more information than we need. And they're filling out the form. So hopefully they won't be putting any other information on the form either. So that, is one way that we'll deal with it without having you, getting any additional information. Second point, you should instruct your employees not to disclose any further medical or family medical information that you have to, maintain confidential. You might have to follow up with an interactive process if you're now learning of an employee's disability. So again, the self-attestation form can address that because you can put it directly on the form, right? Please don't provide any further information. Just fill this form out, right? And we do have a sample form available, which we have a lot of templates available. Hannah will cover that at the end, but this is one of those forms that we've created. So it's compliant and ready for others to use. Finally, one thing to consider is if the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, if that applies to your business, then this is information, that you're collecting from your employees that's private. And so you do want to either update your existing CCPA notice or provide a new one to your employees that indicates that you're collecting this information. So that should be in there. Another question that comes up with this vaccine issue is, what if an employee declines? They don't want to tell us. Thankfully, we have an answer to that question. So the Cal OSHA FAQs actually do answer this, and they indicate that employees do, they can decline to state if they're vaccinated or not. And in that case, what you're supposed to do is treat the employee as if they are unvaccinated, right? So if they won't tell you whether or not they've been vaccinated, then you treat them as if they have not had any vaccination. That means that they wear face covering in the workplace, and all these other exemptions that are provided for fully vaccinated employees will not apply to them, right? And just one thing to note, the revised FAQs, they also do say that you have to, don't take any disciplinary or discriminatory action against the employee if they decline to state their vaccination status. One kind of nuance here is that employers are permitted to have, and this isn't the topic of this, but if you want to do this, you can reach out to Hannah or I, but if employers do want to have a mandatory vaccination policy, meaning requiring that that their employees be vaccinated, they can do so with certain caveats, right? Like you have to provide reasonable accommodation to employees. You can't just require everyone across the board to be vaccinated. But I don't want to cause confusion or make employers think that that's no longer a possibility because of this FAQ. So that is still a possibility here. But if you don't have a mandatory vaccination policy, you're just collecting this information in order to comply with the revised ETS and CDPH guidance, then if an employee declines to state it, that's fine. We don't need to argue with them. We don't need to do anything else except let them know that, okay, then you're considered as someone that's not vaccinated, so please wear your face covering, etc. Okay.
Great. Yeah, that's one that's come up for me as well, that last point there. And so I think it's a good thing to point out because it did seem a little confusing when that FAQ came out.
Yeah.
So one positive is that we have no physical distancing. This revised ETS, that's one of the things that was incorporated here, and it went into effect immediately. Again, in one of the prior versions, it was going to be kind of a delayed plan, but what we have is no longer any requirement to maintain physical distancing, those capacity limits. Again, those weren't really from the ETS itself. Those are really from local orders or, state guidance. But again, a lot of that's all gone as well. And there's also no physical distancing or barriers required, regardless of the vaccination status. What I would like to mention is that, you can go ahead and have physical distancing if you want to, but again, this is what is required, and you are not required to have this except in limited situations, which I'll touch on. So employers must evaluate whether it is necessary to implement physical distancing and barriers during an outbreak. That's one of the situations where you may have to re-implement physical distancing. And again, this is something I hope we're not going to be facing as much. Unfortunately, because of the uptick in cases in the recent weeks, we have actually had employers getting back into outbreaks again. So keeping this in mind. Employers must also implement physical distancing and barriers during a major outbreak. And again, these thresholds, the regular outbreak is generally this 3 within a 14-day period, and the major is 20 within a 30-day period. But again, those are looking really closely at the definitions at play. It's really going to be important to even just determine if you're in an outbreak situation. And then nothing prohibits, as I mentioned, employers from voluntarily maintaining physical distancing and barriers. Same goes for face coverings. I don't think I had actually touched on that earlier, so I did want to also just put out a reminder that if you decide as company policy you want to just maintain face coverings and it's not otherwise required, then you can go ahead and do so, both for your employees and those who enter your facility. And so I'll hand it back over to Aymara, who's going to talk about respirators.
Okay, respirators. So kind of going back to the face mask issue, one of the new and more burdensome requirements under the revised ETS for employers is that employers have to provide respirators for voluntary use to unvaccinated employees upon request, right? So you don't have to immediately, once you have your list of who's not vaccinated, you don't immediately have to provide those employees every day with respirators, but you should have them on hand and available to provide to employees if they request them, right? And when we say respirators, N95s are the respirators that are mentioned in the revised ETS. They're also the most common, respirator that we know of. And so there are others, but I do want to note N95s have a, specific exception to additional requirements under the revised ETS and just general Cal OSHA requirements. So if you are going to provide respirators to your employees, N95 is a good option because you have that extra exception from additional burdensome requirements like having a written respiratory protection plan. That mainly we're gonna focus on N95s because they're the ones that we know that Cal OSHA had in mind when they put in this respirator requirement. Okay, and then during a major outbreak, they do have to be offered for voluntary use to all employees in the exposed group, regardless of their vaccination status. Okay, so as I mentioned, because you're required to provide respirators for voluntary use, you also have to be compliant with some other Cal OSHA rules for voluntary respirator use. So this means that you have to generally provide training on, your policy for providing respirators, which will be that, respirators are provided for voluntary use upon request of the unvaccinated employees. And you have to provide, you have to also train employees that, employees who aren't fully vaccinated have a right to request their respirators for voluntary use. Whenever you provide respirators to employees, you have to train them on how to properly wear the respirator provided. I have gotten a lot of questions on what does this mean. Respirators should come with manufacturer instructions specific to that respirator that you bought on how to use them. So you can use those instructions for the training on specifically how to use them. You also have to provide training on how to perform a seal check each time the respirator is worn, and the fact that facial hair interferes with the seal. So that Cal OSHA FAQs do mention that this is basic instruction on how to get a good seal or fit. Should also be covered in the manufacturer instructions as well. And I do have a couple of other resources about respirators and training that I've had some, employers reach out, is there a video? Is there something like this? So if you wanted to reach out to Hannah or I, we do have those kinds of resources as well, although that's not necessarily a requirement. But some employers do want to make sure that they're, showing their employees how to properly use these. So those resources do exist. There's also a specific document that needs to be provided to employees and that they should acknowledge that they received it. So there is a section 5144, which is the one that has these requirements in it about how to use a respirator for voluntary use. There's an appendix D and it has some information that employees need to be provided with. And because that's a requirement, we want you to make sure that your employees acknowledge that they've gotten that document. So which respirators can you use? Like I said, I'll focus on N95s. There have been a lot of different respirators floating around, especially since the beginning of COVID, probably before that in California because of wildfires as well, because respirators come up then. But even more so, I think, I think we all know what an N95 is now because of COVID, right? So one that comes up a lot is a KN95, right? Which is a very similar respirator to the N95. Can you use a KN95? The answer is no. You have to use a NIOSH approved respirator. And N95s are NIOSH approved. They're on this list. There's a list that NIOSH has. So if you're considering a different respirator, you can reach out to Hannah or I. We can help research that, or at least make sure that you're checking that NIOSH approved list to see if you're using a NIOSH approved respirator. So KN95s are a no for these purposes. You can provide them to employees if you like as the face covering option, but they do not fulfill the respirator option. Okay.
Okay, great. So now moving on to exclusion of employees. As many of you will recall from the original ETS, this is one that, you know, if there's a COVID-19 case in the workplace and there is a close contact, again, this is a definition that was updated to align with what we all commonly know of, that close contact, you know, less than 6 feet for a cumulative total of 15 minutes for it within the 24-hour period. Within someone's infectious period. So within a 24-hour period within the COVID-19 cases infectious period. So what we have is employers must exclude the COVID-19 cases and must exclude those who are close contacts. The amended ETS updated and at least aligned this close contact definition. They used to use a different definition. So now that's this close contact definition. And clearly sets forth that those who are close contacts must be excluded unless they are fully vaccinated before the close contact and have no symptoms. Or if they were previously a COVID-19 case who returned to work and have remained symptom-free for 90 days after the initial onset of symptoms or after the first positive test and then never developed symptoms. Those are two exceptions or exemptions from this. And then there's also one for those who wear respirators. And again, that's kind of more of a fact-specific one. You'll have to look at closely to see, were they wearing a respirator the whole time and all of that. So we didn't actually include it here. Again, really looking at these closely. But another reason to know someone's full, know your employee's, vaccination status is because if there's a close contact, then they do not have to be excluded if they were fully vaccinated at the time of the close contact or have no symptoms. And then the notice requirements. I'll hand that back over to Imara. Or is that the one, or am I doing notice too? I was like,
yeah,
I am, right?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So anyway,
right.
So the notice requirements, sorry for that mix up, but for the notice requirements, again, this is another one that remains in place and it derives from the ETS and also AB 685. So AB 685 went into effect as of January 1, 2021. And what that was, it was a statute which told employers, you need to, provide written notice when there's a COVID-19 case in the workplace. OSHA's previous draft had addressed notice, but didn't specifically state that it must be written. The updated draft in this revised version of the ETS now specifically expressly states that written notice must be given. But again, this was already a requirement since January 1 anyways under AB 685, that written notice must be given. And that written notice, as a reminder, must be given within 1 business day of you receiving notice that there was a COVID-19 case in the workplace. And then it must be provided to all employees at the work site during the high-risk exposure period. That high-risk exposure period really is that 2 days going back before somebody develops symptoms, or going back 2 days before the first positive test specimen was collected, and then going forward 10 days. So it's really important when you do the investigation piece to make sure you obtain that information so that you're able to identify who was on your work site during that infectious period to give notice. So you need to give notice to employees, independent contractors, and employers of others who are on your work site during that infectious period. Notice may be provided by personal service, email, or text message, just reasonably anticipated to be received by the employee within 1 business day. Again, we're focusing on the receipt of the employee, but again, those others also need to receive that notice within 1 business day. Again, this really aligns with AB 685, so these aren't huge changes, but again, just to put on your radar that this is what was changed. And then in terms of the new verbal follow-up requirement, this is one that we did see that is a new requirement in the ETS. And this new verbal follow-up requirement is that if the employer should reasonably know that an employee has not received notice or has limited literacy in the language used in the notice, the employer shall provide verbal notice as soon as practicable in a language understandable by the employee. So what does that mean? I mean, this just seems like probably was well-intentioned, but nobody really knows what this means, right? You're supposed to reasonably know that the employee has not received notice. I'm not sure how you would do that, right? Or has limited literacy, again, in the language used in the notice, and then provide verbal notice in a language understandable, again. So, I mean, look, what we recommend is that if you have a larger percentage of non-speaking, non-English speaking employees, then having that notice translated into that language. Or, again, having, not a really overly complicated notice, that's helpful as well for those who may have, employee population that has maybe more limited literacy in the English language. And so now I will hand it back over to Aymara to go through testing and other obligations.
Okay, so testing. So this is another one that already existed, right? In the original ETS, there were testing obligations, but they did add an additional testing obligation, and this, went into effect as soon as the revised or amended ETS went into effect, so June 17th, and that additional obligation is that you must make testing available at no cost to employees with COVID-19 symptoms who are not fully vaccinated during the employee's paid time. What does that mean? So if an employee has COVID-19 symptoms and they are on your list of not fully vaccinated, you have to provide them with testing. This is, first of all, not limited to instances of workplace exposure. So this isn't an instance where, they have COVID symptoms because they were visiting their mom this weekend, or we know they went to a party. There's no distinction made here. Kind of makes sense because we never really know where people's COVID symptoms are coming from. So we can't make any distinctions of, they weren't exposed in the workplace, so we don't have to provide testing here. So anytime an employee who's not fully vaccinated has COVID symptoms and you know of it, then you have to make testing available. The good news to keep in mind is that making testing available under the revised ETS just means that you have to provide the employee information on where to get tested, right? Where and how do you get testing? So providing information on free testing sites provided by the county or the state, that meets this requirement, right? So if you find out that an employee has COVID symptoms, you can have these resources already ready to go to let them know this is where you can go to get tested. You're also responsible for paying for the cost of any test. So as I mentioned, if you're sending them to a free site, there shouldn't be any cost, but if for some reason there is, that is a responsibility of the employer, and the employees, this has to be provided during their paid time, which means that they need to be paid for the time it takes to get that testing. So if they, for some reason, go to Dodger Stadium and it takes 2 hours, that's how long it took for them to get the testing. So make sure that you tell employees to, report back the time it took for the testing so that you can cover that as well.
Yeah, this is actually an area I've seen a lot of employers put this out and it's been worded incorrectly. So I think making that point clear is important, because saying you'll just reimburse for all the costs of, related to the test could be misinterpreted from a legal standpoint. So making clear that you'll pay for all that time. I think that's one I've seen a lot of employers kind of not get right.
Exactly. So it's the time that they spend on the testing, not just the test. So you're not free and clear just because we're sending them to free testing sites. Okay, and so then we've also got a requirement of testing after there's a COVID case in the workplace. And this is a requirement, an obligation that already existed under the original ETS, but they have revised the language to make it a bit more clear. So it used to say that all employees who had a potential COVID exposure, whatever that meant, were supposed to receive testing, right? So now it provides that testing must be made available to all employees who had a close contact. So that is if we have a COVID case in the workplace and you do your contact tracing and you find out, Sam and Sally had close contact, Sam and Sally, you have to provide or make available free testing for them, right? So you can do it in the same way that I just mentioned with providing information about the free testing sites. And it has to be at no cost to them, which means if they for some reason have to pay for the cost, you have to reimburse them, and during their paid time. Okay, so as Hannah mentioned, that doesn't mean just, okay, it was a free testing site, we don't have to pay for anything. We do have to be paying for the time that it takes to go get that test. But we also have some exceptions to this. So you do not need to provide testing to employees who were close contact, but they were fully vaccinated before the close contact. So if someone has had 1 dose of a 2-dose vaccine, they're not considered fully vaccinated. So at that point, that employee would be excluded from the workplace due to the exposure, and they'd be eligible for this testing under this testing requirement. So if they're fully vaccinated before the close contact, then and they don't have COVID symptoms, then you don't have to provide them with testing. So when someone's fully vaccinated and they do start showing COVID symptoms, this exception really goes out the window for them. At that point, they're going to be much closer to becoming a COVID case than someone who's fully vaccinated and accepted from all of these things. So watch out for that. They do have to be asymptomatic. And then the other exception is same as with the close contacts, the face cover, or not the face coverings, the close contacts, employees who were previously a COVID case. So they're considered to have natural immunity as long as they've met their return to work requirements before, which means that they've stayed home for those 10 days. Their symptoms have improved, they don't have a fever, and they've remained symptom-free for 90 days from their initial symptoms or after their first positive test, if they were just an asymptomatic case. So those employees are also accepted from this testing requirement.
So this is one I think too that you just touched on the nuance, but kind of looking out for is, you have that employee that was identified as the close contact. They were fully vaccinated before the close contact, but then if they have symptoms, that's where really this testing kicks in. And then as you also mentioned about the exclusion part, right, is that they wouldn't meet the exemption at that point. But it's been one I've noticed has been a little bit more of a nuanced kind of thought process as you're going through that when you have a COVID-19 case.
Yes, and with the uptick in cases lately, we have seen, employees who are fully vaccinated who do start showing symptoms and do end up being a COVID case. So it's definitely something to look out for. And that will kind of bring me into the next part of we've gone over today all of these changes that have been made, but please don't only get caught up in the revisions that were made and know that this was a pre-existing document with a lot of obligations for employers, and a lot of those obligations still remain in place. And some of them, I think one of them that I'm currently thinking of, are very, very important to keep doing, especially with the recent uptick in cases. So first of all, there is still a requirement to establish, implement, and maintain an effective written COVID prevention plan. So if you already had one, you should be revising it, right, to take into account all of these revisions that we're discussing. And if you didn't have one, now is a really, really good time to put one into place, right? And it is a requirement, and this is a requirement especially for smaller employers that you may not be used to because you didn't have to have maybe an IIPP in writing, right? If you have less than 10 employees. But there is no exception for teeny tiny employers in this one when it comes to the ETS, okay? So you do have to have a written plan in place. So now is a great time to do that if you don't already. And then continuous symptom screening. This is the one that I was thinking of. For some reason, I don't know where the wires got crossed, but I've seen and I've heard from so many employers, that for some reason people thought that you didn't have to do symptom screening anymore. You just let your employees back in the workplace. No, you have to continue symptom screening. And when I say symptom screening, sometimes it's referred to as health screening. I mean asking your employees if they have any COVID symptoms, going through that list before they come to work, asking if they've had close contact with a COVID case and recently, if they've traveled. Those kinds of questions are very, very important to continue asking, and you should be asking them regardless of vaccination status, right? Because as Hannah and I mentioned, we have been seeing that someone is fully vaccinated and they still get COVID symptoms. They still test positive for COVID sometimes, definitely not as often as those who are not vaccinated. It's not, the vaccines, I'm not trying to say that they don't work or anything like that. But we have to continue symptom screening for that purpose and also because it's required, right? But I think especially with how things are right now, it's very, very important to continue this.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. And so the one thing I did want to mention is that the ETS, although it says that you must continue symptom screening and it didn't change the language, one clarification too is that it doesn't specify the exact kind of symptom screening you must perform. So again, that's going to be an evaluation of what works in your workforce and things like that. Some of the local orders did have very specific requirements, or it must be this temperature, and if they hit this temperature, you must exclude them. So the ETS really just requires, as Aymar is mentioning, that you still screen for COVID-19 symptoms and evaluate if your employees may have those symptoms. And again, thinking about if you're doing that before they come to the workplace, are there any wage and hour issues that may, come up? Are you compensating for that time? There's other considerations there as well. So just making sure you're covering those.
Yes, exactly. So 2 more points about symptom screening is one thing that I've gotten questions is, do we still have to take temperatures? And the ETS never required that temperatures be taken. It does have some specifications for, how you should be what you should be doing if you are temperature screening, right? Making sure that both of the people involved, the person taking temperatures and the person getting their temperature taken, are being protected. But it's not required. But there were some local orders, like Hannah mentioned, that said, you had to do temperature screening, or you had to do it if feasible. Most of those local orders have been rescinded, but that's another, place where it's very important to continue checking, especially in these Southern California counties, because they've been issuing, I'm looking at you, LA County, but they've been issuing, new orders with new requirements. So it's important to keep on top of those local orders as well. But in terms of symptom screening, you don't have to, actually take temperatures. And another thing that the ETS does say is that you are permitted to ask your employees to check their symptoms before they come to work. So that's a way that you can do it. And that does work for some workplaces. But like Hannah mentioned, one of the things you want to be cautious about is that that's time that employees are taking to go to work. So that is most likely time that should be compensated, that should be paid time. So we need to find a way that we're capturing that time if we're asking employees to do it from home. Another note is that I have heard from a lot of employers, okay, well, can we scrap the app where they fill out the questions, or can we scrap, the documentation of the symptom screening? Yes, it's not required that you have, a signed document from your employee every day saying that they did it. But if you have a situation where they don't, and it affects your workplace and you want to take some kind of action, that is, whether or not you have documentation that you were conducting the symptom screening is pretty important, generally, and in that instance. So consider that as well if you do want to scrap your documentation or your app. It might be a good idea to just keep that in place. It was working before, you have to do the symptom screening. I would recommend keeping, your prior method, if it was good and it was working, in place already. So don't get too relaxed. Other things that are still in place, and I'll just go through them quickly. Notice requirements, like Hannah mentioned, there were some tweaks to the language, but there are still notice requirements. You still have to give notice. And that is a very, very time sensitive thing, right? 1 business day. So keep that in mind. When you hear of a COVID case, you should have a plan already for how you're going to get those notices out, or it's time to call someone who can help, like me or Hannah. So if you didn't have a plan in place, keep in mind, it might be a good time to reach out to help quickly get those notices out. Exclusion, that we've covered that, but that's very important. It's still in place. And so is, if it's a work-related close contact, so is continuance of wages, right? I don't think we covered in detail, but you do have to continue what Cal OSHA has termed exclusion pay. So employees do need to be paid when there's a work-related close contact and they're excluded from the workplace. We have to maintain their pay. One of the ways that we can do this that Cal OSHA has said was, if your business is covered by California supplemental paid sick leave, then you can have employees use that time during that time. But if they don't have it available, then it's still paid time for them. Another one, or the other 3 here that I want you to keep in mind that haven't had big updates but are still in place, is testing requirements, which we did cover, but those exist for now just employees who have COVID symptoms and aren't fully vaccinated. Outbreaks and major outbreaks, that comes with additional testing requirements, right? And then we've got employer provided housing and transportation. If that applies to your business, I know it doesn't apply to many, but there are employers who provide either housing or transportation to their employees, even shuttles, from one work location to the other, that can be something that's covered. So there are requirements there for employers that they must follow.
Okay, great. Yeah, and so I just wanted to go back really quick on the notification and just state that, although we covered the, changes, please note that the notifications have very specific requirements about what certain information must be provided to employees in those notices. So again, I'm going to go into that next, but in terms of, having those prepared, as Imara said, just having those ready. And then the last piece, and I think, Imara, you may have touched on or not, is just that training, that we must make sure training is provided.
Yes. So Thank you. I don't know how I skipped this huge paragraph that's here and it's in my notes. But yes, you have to provide training to your employees, and most of you probably did, right, when the original ETS came out. So a question that we get is, do we have to do it again? Well, yes, I would say so. There's no clarity if, there's no exception that says if you did this before, you don't have to do it again. And on top of that, there is some additional, requirements that have been added, specifically that you have to, provide employees information about testing and vaccination, and also, indicate to your employees that the vaccines are effective in, preventing hospitalization and death. And so that's a new training requirement. So you should take that initial training that you had, update it, and give it again to your employees.
Okay. And then just really thinking about what to do next, and how to prepare and stay in line with these updates, so that if you have a COVID-19 case in your workplace, what to do. So again, looking at this amended ETS, getting familiar with what these changes are, although we've covered them, there are further details. We also have an insight, article that has been published on this. You can look at it. And also, as Imara mentioned, look at your written COVID-19 prevention program and any notices and other policies that you had in place prior to these updates. Make sure that those are all updated. We have updated compliance packets for all of these documents. So every document we talked about today, we have prepared that document in sample communications that go along with those documents. We also have a detailed memo that really walks you through what to do if you have a COVID-19 case in the workplace. So if you want to have access to those compliance packets, they are at a cost, but you feel welcome to reach out to us and we'd be able to provide you with more detail on that. And then really looking at, again, some of the vaccine considerations that were touched on today, thinking about how will you go about doing that if you haven't already done so, in terms of collecting that vaccination status of your employee population and what to do there. And one thing, we touched on a lot about employee vaccination status and what to do there. If you're the type of business that has others coming onto your work site, I think it's important also to make sure you read what the CDPH has put out in that regard. And although you do not have to verify others' vaccination status who are coming onto your work site, you can do so. So again, that's another area that if you want more information, we'd be happy to provide it to you. And then again, that stocking up on N95s and having those available in case you get a request for use on those N95s.
And one note about the N95s that I wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of is that California does have a program for assisting employers in initially stocking up on the N95s, and I believe it's still available. So look into that. There was a lot of concern from employers when this revised ETS was coming out about, how are we going to get N95s? We thought it was, there was a shortage. So California did implement a program to help employers, initially stock up on that. So look into that if for some reason you're having issues, although I haven't heard from a lot of employers that there has been issues stocking up on N95s. But if that becomes a problem, that may be a solution.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, a resource that is available. So with that, I think really we really covered most of the questions for today. So with that, I think it kind of wraps us up here and we're at the end. And if there's anything else though, Emily, then we'd be happy to go through it.
Yeah, so I actually have two questions that I thought I could pose to you guys. And then everyone who's still with us, if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the Q&A. So my first question, you had given a couple thresholds for what defines an outbreak in a workplace. And I was curious, I think what I heard was just some solid numbers, not like a percentage of your workforce. So I'm curious how those outbreak thresholds apply to companies companies like mine that are smaller, we've got 6 employees, is it really just a number of employees versus like a percentage of your workforce?
So I think that's a really good question, because that has also been an area of confusion, because the outbreaks under the ETS, and actually that we've seen otherwise in this context for reporting to the California, any of your local health departments, those are just numbers. As I mentioned, it was the 3 and the 20. And again, it's really looking close at the exposed group and COVID-19 cases there. So you really have to look there. And that's why we didn't go into too much detail. But what I think the percentage has come up is because when we look in the context of reporting for workers' compensation purposes, they do use a percentage formula. And there was a lot of controversy about these outbreak numbers. When you're talking about a small employer, you're talking about a really large employer who says, I have 3 cases, why I have so many employees, so there's been a lot of arguments on both sides about using the percentage or using the numbers, and why, percentage might not be fair, or why, numbers might not be fair. But what we have is we have numbers in this context.
Awesome. We do have one question in the Q&A. I know this was touched on, but do all of these recommendations and mandates apply to 1099s or other types of temporary or contract employees?
So these apply to employees. And so again, that's another area that, again, is another complicated California issue, right? So if you've misclassified, contractors as contractors and they were really employees, then that could raise a whole nother, host of issues. And like Imara said, could give rise to wage and hour issues and other things. So again, generally speaking, no, this applies to your employees, not employees of, the temporary service agency. Again, those are all other kind of further nuances, but no, this is really to your employees only. The notice though, however, as mentioned, is to go out to all, again, it will go to independent contractors, will go to employers of others.
Great. And so let's take just one more step back to offer some clarification. So you can't, tell me if this is right, you can't be a contract employee. You're either a W-2 employee of a company, in which case all these things would apply, or you're a 1099 contractor, in which case other things apply.
Correct. I mean, I think for our purposes, if you're a business looking at this, you're really going to be, these requirements that we're talking about, testing, exclusion, all those things apply to your employees. And if you're an independent contractor, yeah, there's going to be other things to worry about, but that's not for this purpose.
Yeah. And just a plug to not misclassify your employees as independent contractors. It may look appealing at the beginning because of certain things, but it's a really bad idea and it's illegal. So don't do it.
Very expensive choice.
Very expensive choice. And we actually saw this trend a lot in the beginning of the pandemic where, we worked with a lot of businesses who were playing things a little fast and loose. So, maybe you didn't have a separate bank account. Maybe you were not properly reporting all of your income. If, you're a primarily cash-based business or whatever, maybe you didn't have really clean books. And this has really put an emphasis on why it's actually important and beneficial to run a super clean business, do it all above board. If you had all of those things in place, it was so easy to apply for the pandemic support, to get the proper level of support, right? If you were misclassifying employees as contractors, then you couldn't get that PPP loan to cover who really are your employees. So run your business above board. I promise it's worth it. Okay, one more question. Do the requirements apply to volunteers for a nonprofit?
So that's another area, right? That is it's a whole nother area that you have to really look at. It's not as straightforward as you would think.
Yeah. And I think what we can say about that one is this applies to employees. Generally, volunteers are not employees, but a lot of these things may be a very good idea to do with your volunteers as well, right? One thing that I do want to remind, employers of is that the virus does not care if this person is an independent contractor or an employee, right? These are requirements, but some of them are a very good idea, right? Excluding someone who has COVID symptoms from your workplace, you should do that no matter what their status is, right? As an employee or independent contractor, whether or not you have to provide them pay during that time, sure, yes, let's make that distinction between employee and independent contractor and volunteer there. But, you know, taking care of the health of everyone in the workplace is very important as well, right? There is possible liability that comes with just not, you know, providing reasonable care for all of these people that are in your workplace as well. So keep that in mind too.
Our clients are primarily nonprofits, and I'm giving them the same encouragement where it's like, I do not want to be the one who has to call 50 volunteers to say, well, you were exposed, you need to self-quarantine. And that's a very different conversation if you were being a little loose with things versus I know that we did everything possible to keep everybody safe. And, you know, there was an exposure. Those are two really different, like the perception of those conversations is really different. So yeah, I completely agree.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like,
so
everyone's health is in our own best interest. So whether it's required or not, it's really upon all of us to care for those in our community.
Yeah, exactly. So things like, you know, do you have to provide, you know, masks at no cost to these other people who aren't your employees? Maybe not, right? But having masks available for people to put on their face while they're in your workplace is such a good idea, right? And it's just one, you know, small thing that you can do that can very much save your business a lot of other costs, right? Because if you have someone who's not an employee come in as a COVID case, they can still, you know, give the virus to other people who are your employees, and then all of these obligations kick in anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Masks aren't free necessarily unless you get them through one of the programs, but they're definitely a lot cheaper than having to roll out this whole like COVID plan if you have an outbreak.
Yep, exactly.
My friends, I believe we've come to the end of the questions. Anything else you'd like to share with our attendees today?
No, I think that's really it. We really appreciate the opportunity. And if there's anything further, we're happy to be a resource and, you know, reach out to us.
Awesome. So Brianne's going to put everyone's contact information in the chat. In the next couple days, everyone will get an email with the PowerPoint and the recording. And happy Friday, my friends. Thank you all for being with us here at EDC. Call those helplines. It is free to receive services from EDC. Like I mentioned, I'm a very proud EDC client. They've helped me through a lot of hard times like the Thomas Fire and now the pandemic. And so you're not alone. You don't have to do this by yourself. And there is free, very talented professional resources available to you. And it's literally just one phone call away. So stay safe. Have a good weekend, everyone. And it was nice sharing time with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.